Hello, everyone! Welcome to another Mysterious Galaxy virtual event. I am Nick, the Director of Events and Digital Marketer for the store. Tonight, on the eve of his book's release, when this is being done, we have Ben Riggs. Hello, Ben Riggs!
Greetings, fellow humans.
And non-humans out there that might be in outer space. Join in conversation with him tonight is Mysterious Galaxy's very own Tom Thurman. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
Ben Riggs is a writer, teacher, and podcaster. His RPG podcast, Plot Points, has been running for the last decade, and his work has appeared on NPR and Geek Sundry. As I mentioned, in conversation is Tom Thurman. He's a longtime customer, supporter, volunteer, DM extraordinaire in our our first and third Sundays of the month, the D&D campaigns in the store. Great guy. So thank you so much for both of you being here.
No problem.
This is my idea of a good time.
What, talking about D&D?
Yeah. Although I do have some questions about that art behind you.
Oh, it's from a cruise. My parents bought it a long time ago.
That's fantastic. I love it.
Like I mentioned, though, tonight we are celebrating Ben's release of Slaying the Dragon, which reveals the true story of the rise and fall of TSR. For those of you who may not know, like I didn't really know until I saw the arc of the book, because I'm new to D&D in the last 4 years. So I didn't know the rich history of D&D quite yet. TSR is the company that rocketed D&D to success, producing multiple copies and editions of it, and pretty much introduced the role-playing game medium. But I won't get too in-depth because Ben has done that in his book. So you have spent the research and all the time in culmination of this. How do you feel on the eve of your release?
It feels like Christmas Eve. This was 6 years of work. And it's amazing to see it ready to go out there and fly. And I'm super excited about it. I would be very interested at some point, if you actually read the book, hearing your feedback on it, because I certainly hope that it reads well to people that are a little bit newer to D&D. I teach 7th and 8th grade in my real life, and one day this year I wandered into the teacher's lounge, and it was nothing but women under 30 discussing their D&D campaigns. So I made sure to throw a couple early reader copies to them, because again, I was hoping to get a wider audience with this. But hey, anytime you want to email me and tell me what you thought about the book, I would love to know, because I think there's going to be a second one. So,
oh, okay, that gets a question out of the way from later on.
And I actually have read the book though. The store gave me an art because I'm like, I can't talk about a book I haven't read. So
if anyone out there hasn't yet got their, well, of course you haven't, because it comes out tomorrow, but if you haven't pre-ordered your copy yet of Slaying the Dragon, you'll notice there's a link below that'll take you to our website. There you can still pre-order, because it's out tomorrow, your own copy. And Ben has been wonderful enough to supply signed book plates, so you will get shut up, phone. You will get book plates while supplies last. And if you see us this week at Comic-Con, we might have some of the book and book plates there if they're still there.
May I briefly mention the book plate?
Yes, you may.
So the cover of the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide and Player's Handbook was designed by a genius fantasy artist named Jeff Easley. And I interviewed him extensively for the book, and he was kind enough to design the book plate for me, which I signed.
Oh my
gosh.
So
this is the only way that you will get this book plate designed by a D&D icon. And he did not hold back. There's like a skeleton riding a dragon on it. There's some wizard using telekinesis to pull gold out of a treasure chest for no reason I can see. The treasure chest is about 8 inches away from him, and he's like, telekinesis. It is pretty awesome, heavy metal, straight up old school D&D. And again, the only way to get that unique Jeff Easley art is to pre-order it through Mysterious Galaxy, and it doesn't even cost you any extra money, right?
No, it doesn't. It just comes with your book. Get the book now. And if you have any questions you want to ask Ben later in the program, there's another button below that says Ask a Question, and we will be getting to those later in the program. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cast invisibility for now, but it doesn't last the full hour. I will come back shorter than that.
All right.
I will see you all in a bit.
Rock and roll.
We're not that boring. So I mentioned before, I actually did get to read the book. One of the things I thought was really interesting is you talk a lot about a few times that certain people get painted as the villains, but mostly because they're not there to tell their own story. Notably, Brian Thompson and Lorraine Williams. Obviously, with Brian Thompson, it was because he was his past. But Lorraine Williams, how painful was it to not be able to interview her, to have her input into the book?
So, well, I mean, so if anyone doesn't know, Lorraine Williams was the CEO of TSR, the first company to make D&D from 1987 until 1997. She was the last CEO of TSR, for that matter. And history will be thirsty for her words. I have contacted her. She told me that she would not do an interview with me in no uncertain terms. That said, I am optimistic about hearing from her again. So in the book, there's a frontispiece. There's a tarot card an artist made with Lorraine Williams on it. I think she looks regal and beautiful. And the book is going to be reviewed in the Washington Post in August.
Oh.
And I think that is going to crack that facade. I think that it's going to be really hard for her to have family and friends contacting her about the beautiful art of her in one of the nation's papers of record and just be like, well, I'm just going to let that ship sail. You know, right. I think she's going to contact me again. She may contact me to threaten me with a lawsuit because she's very litigious. She may just thank me for the image and move on with her life. But I'm hoping she's like, okay, I'll sit down. You know, right. This beautiful art has cut through my reserve. Because while I tried to make this the complete story of why TSR failed in the 90s and was purchased by Wizards of the Coast, I do not have her words in this book, really. Like, right. There was one interview with her where I got some words in, and a lot of people tell me about her. I interviewed her brother extensively, but she could read my book and be like, you got it all wrong, kid. And it would be really important to record her at least saying, I got it all wrong. Right. Now, I don't think I got it all wrong because I got so many primary source documents. It would be kind of hard for her to come back and say, you got it all wrong. And I'd be like, well, what about these contracts? Right. You know, what about these sales numbers? How do I have it all? Like, what about the interviews I did with like 56 other people? How can everyone be wrong but you? But again, I try to be a bit impartial where I don't have primary source documentation. Another person you mentioned was Brian Thompson, who was in charge of the TSR fiction line, and he passed away in 2008. And he had an incredibly bitter conflict with R.A. Salvatore, author of the Drizzt novels. And in the book, I go out of my way to be like, so here's what Bob Salvatore says about his conflict with Brian Thompson. And then thankfully, through good fortune, Brian Thompson's best friend at the company was able to talk to me and tell me, okay, so here's what Brian told me back in the day. Yeah. So at least I get a version of his events. Because when I have two conflicting events, I really try to give everybody their due. But yes, it's regrettable and sad that Lorraine Williams didn't want to talk to me about this, because probably nobody else is going to come around and ask her about the most important thing that happened in her life, which is TSR, even if she doesn't realize it right now.
So, yeah, one of the things I liked in the book was you did that a couple times where you would tell a story and then even just kind of point out, was it one of the guys at TSR got fired, and you heard two different stories for how he was fired, and he doesn't remember either of them.
Yeah. So the Friday before Christmas in 1996, TSR fired 24 people. And the last person to be fired that day was game editor John Ratliff. He's gone on to be arguably the greatest living J.R.R. Tolkien scholar. He wrote a 2-volume history of the Hobbit, dissecting Tolkien's drafts of the Hobbit. So brilliant mind. But he doesn't remember how he got fired that day, but 2 other people do. One person says that John Ratliff was standing with him in his cubicle, and everyone was told, don't leave your cubicles. You'll get a phone call, so don't leave your cubicles. But everyone left their cubicles to go huddle in their friends' cubicles because they were afraid. So John Ratliff was with Monty Cook, the author of creator of Numenera and co-designer of 3rd edition D&D. And Monty Cook says that he remembers the phone in John Ratliff's cubicle going off and John Ratliff running away to answer it, and that's when he got fired. Dragon magazine editor Dale Donovan, however, remembers that John Ratliff was going around giving out candy canes because it was the week Friday before Christmas, and so he wasn't in his cubicle. He was giving out candy canes, and the head of HR found him on the stairs and just kind of snatched him away to go get fired. And Dale Donovan saw this happen, and he knew how dreadful it was, and he was like, "I'm going out for Chinese food for lunch because this is just so upsetting." So yeah, I tried to give everyone everyone's story when I didn't have some way of telling what was the true story.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. The book is very, very readable. Like going in, it was something I assumed would be very dry. But like your personality really shines through in a lot of it, and especially when you're telling those kind of potentially 2-sided stories, like this is what I heard here, this is what I heard here, and even just pointing out like the humor of this is a weird incongruence, but I can't do anything about that.
Yeah, some reviewers have described it as dishy and novelistic.
Yeah, that would sound about accurate. It definitely made it it was a page turner, and I think especially the fact of like the your personal voice in it made it very easy to just kind of keep going along. Like I hadn't quite finished everything when I got to the weekend, and I just spent like half my Sunday burning through the remainder of the book. And even every time I sat down, I would just read and read and read, and was late from lunch at work a couple times. So.
I will tell you, as a first time author, that is absolutely delightful to hear, because I can't imagine anything more dreadful than writing a boring book.
No, this is not boring at all. And like I started playing D&D when I was in elementary school, and I was I think in middle school when the buyout happened. So I had very, very strong feelings as a middle schooler at the time, and this definitely made me kind of revisit some of those and change my reactions, because I remember being really mad at Wizards for buying out TSR, and now obviously they have a very, very different perspective on it. And even I think interestingly, I always remember looking back on all of the product lines and loving that, and being one of those people that's very vocal about, hey, bring this stuff back, and then reading through and go, oh no, that's why Wizards isn't doing any of that.
Yeah. So I'm assuming the audience is largely dyed-in-the-wool D&D fans who would know that in the 90s you had this shocking rise in D&D and AD&D settings. I want to say by the end, TSR had like 13 different settings for
Something
Advanced
ridiculous.
Dungeons and Dragons. And 5th edition has done nothing like that, obviously. I want to say when I was looking at releases while writing the book, like there were years TSR released more setting material than Wizards of the Coast did for the entire run of 5th edition. And it's because when Wizards was doing a post-mortem on TSR, a post-mortem notably run by Lisa Stevens, the current publisher of Paizo, creators of the Pathfinder role-playing game, she determined that you could correlate the drop in TSR sales to the proliferation of settings. And she concluded that what TSR was doing was cannibalizing their own customer base with setting after setting after setting after setting. And if you have people that like Ravenloft, they're going to stop buying stuff for the Forgotten Realms. And if they then go on to like Planescape and not Ravenloft, they're going to stop buying things for Ravenloft. And people tended to be fans of settings, not fans of Dungeons and Dragons. And she believes that killed the game. And you can see with Paizo, they do not have a proliferation of settings. And it certainly seems like Wizards of the Coast agrees, because they have only with the greatest hesitancy embarked on creating more settings for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. This oddly this summer again we're getting an explosion of them. We're getting Spelljammer and Dragonlance this summer, which is a lot, but it is clear that Wizards now thinks that 5th edition is so successful that it almost doesn't matter. And if their marketing material is to be believed, D&D is probably more popular. I shouldn't say probably. D&D is exponentially more popular right now than it ever has been in the history of the game before, which might be why they're like, we're going to take a risk and we'll do Spelljammer, Dragonlance, and they'll kind of be one-offs, and that's that.
Well, and that's kind of what's different between how Wizards handles their campaign settings and TSR. TSR they were product lines, whereas Wizards like, here's your book and we're done. Like, they've never gone back to Ravnica or Theros or any of the other settings they've released. It's that one book. And if you want anything else, you're going on to like DM's Guild and seeing what other third parties have kind of made.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And Stranger Things definitely has helped.
Yes.
Like for my local paper, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, they interviewed me a few weeks ago, and it was fantastic. But of course, the image at the top of the article isn't me. It's not the book. It's Eddie Munson from Stranger Things. Which again, as an author, I'm like, great. This is wonderful promotion. Yeah, put Eddie Munson all over my stuff. And I will tell you, yeah, he is. I've gone back and forth with my publisher a few times because we just can't believe our luck. Stranger Things ends within three weeks of my D&D history book coming out. And again, if you haven't seen Stranger Things season 4, episode 1 of season 4 has what is probably the most beautiful, idealized representation of a D&D game in any mass media. Not the most accurate, mind you, but most beautiful and idealized.
I would agree with that.
Did I answer your those two questions? I guess I shouted that out into the audience too. But
oh yeah. Okay, so you have a lot of stories in this book. Were there any that you heard during the interviews that you could just not find a place for in the book, but you really wish you could?
Yeah. Everything about 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. In my initial plan for the book, so the book really focuses on 1985 to 1997, and has a pretty hard stop after Wizards buys TSR, fixes a bunch of mistakes, and we learn that a bunch of the staff is going to relocate to Seattle. But I was like, and I'll go on and do a chapter on 3rd edition, 5,000 words maybe, because 3rd edition is a huge success. I'll interview the 3rd edition guys. They're going to tell me that they're all geniuses and they were hugely successful. I went and interviewed them, and the story I got from the 3rd edition guys was one of lies, betrayal, backstabbing, and sabotage in some cases.
Oh wow.
Recriminations, bitter feelings, Machiavellian manipulations, and what I thought was again going to be like a fairly short and Wizards fixed D&D, yay, turned into 20,000 words, and it is probably the seed of a next book, because I couldn't believe some of the things that happened in the creation of 3rd edition, and given the dastardly deeds sometimes involved, it's shocking that 3rd edition was as successful and well put together as it was.
Yeah, the book definitely seems to leave off on I guess it feels very hopeful, because you spend a lot of time with Peter Atkins going around trying to right all the wrongs that have been done to staff and authors and fixing those relationships. It definitely does feel like it's heading off in a brighter, sunnier direction. So that's interesting that the next one is, or gets, presumably this would be the next book that you referenced earlier.
So yeah, the next book, assuming that there's a next book, which I think there's going to be, I would focus around the question of what happens when you give away your intellectual property. Like, what if Disney said one day, hey, everybody, we paid $6 billion for Star Wars, but just anybody can make a Star Wars movie now. Like, what happens to that company? Because that's one of the things that happens with 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. And I feel like it's an interesting way to frame the next phase of D&D history. Because again, hopefully it opens it up a little bit, makes it a little bit more of a business book than just a D&D history book. But 3rd edition and the creation of 3rd edition and that messed up story is what would be the first part of book 2. Did that answer your question, or did I ramble off into the weeds?
No, I mean, basically I kind of asked if that was going to be the structure for book 2. So I guess first half is pretty much an answer.
Or Act 1.
Okay. So what was the favorite story that you had about like just the stuff that happened at TSR? Because there were so many colorful ones, just like the Nerf wars, people falling to the ceiling.
Favorite story. That's an interesting. Wow, so many. I'll go with the Peter Adkison story, because Peter Adkison is the most successful tabletop role-playing executive of all time. He is, in his way, a genius. And one of the things that I discovered while writing this book was that I really focus on creative geniuses and think about, like, oh my God, Bob Salvatore, he really connected with Dries Stewart and Tracy Hickman. Holy cow. Like, the first Ravenloft adventure is fantastic and the greatest D&D adventure of all time. And it's only 32 pages long. But as I was telling this story, I really came to appreciate people with genius in other domains. And Peter Adkison has the ability to hear a pitch and figure out which one is going to make $1 billion. Mm-hmm. He was, pitched Magic the Gathering in a parking lot in Seattle. And he says that he started hooting and hollering and screaming when it was pitched to him, because he was like, this is going to change the world. And the first time I heard that story, I heard it from Peter Adkison. I'm like, yeah, I get it. You were really excited. And I hear it from his mouth. So he has the ability to revise that memory to tell that story, right? Because we all know that Magic the Gathering went on to be this huge phenomenon and create an entire category of gaming.
Yeah.
Then I found that exact same story on a Usenet group from like 1994 or 1995, where Peter Adkison is telling this story 6 months before Magic the Gathering comes out, which means that Peter Adkison is the guy who literally was able to hear a pitch and be like, that will make $1 billion. And he was flipping right. Like, if you go to a gaming convention and you go to the, new designer alley, almost everyone thinks that they have some idea that's going to change the world and that their game is going to be the best, and and they'll tell you why. Mm-hmm. But Peter Adkison is the guy who heard the pitch, made the call, and he was right. And again, he has the receipts to prove it. Like, he was on the internet saying that Magic the Gathering was going to change the world 6 months before it came out, and he was right. And that was a story that I didn't know. And again, I certainly knew Peter Adkison as the CEO of Wizards of the Coast. I knew him as the owner of Gen Con. But the fact that his talents came to bear on geek history in just the right way at just the right time to benefit all of us. If Peter Adkison didn't embrace Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons may be dead today, and there may be no collectible card games on the market, and we would all be nerdily poorer for it.
Yeah, especially considering the book goes over this a little bit, that in a last-ditch attempt to save itself, TSR was using the various IP as collateral. So if they had gone bankrupt, like, you could have had the reality of somebody owning the Player's Handbook and somebody owning the DMG, and like D&D would be next to impossible to revise as we knew it.
Yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning this because, ironically, this is the one thing I'm not mentioning on social media. When I say it's a secret history of D&D, this is the one where I'm like, I'm not going to mention this, and people just get to. I think of this as the ending of the book, but hey, you know what? Like we're on this call, we're going to talk about it right now.
Sorry if I spoiled something.
No, this is. I mean, if people come to a seminar called "The Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons," you want to hear some secrets, and this was so secret. Again, Peter Adkison didn't know this when he purchased TSR. That is how hidden this was. So TSR owed Random House, I want to say $10 million, and they had no way of paying it down. Random House sued TSR in the spring of 1996. And in order to keep Random House at bay, TSR, exactly as you said, took its intellectual property and used it as collateral on a loan. And the deeply disturbing thing about it was that the intellectual property was things like the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, and if the company had gone bankrupt, and you had one organization buy the Player's Handbook, one buy the Dungeon Master's Guide, the question then becomes, who on earth owns Dungeons and Dragons?
Right.
And it would have to be settled by a judge. It would have been a nightmare. It might have killed the game, might have killed the hobby. Who knows? And when Peter Adkison wanted to buy TSR, he went to the Wizards of the Coast board of directors and was like, I want to buy TSR. It's going to cost this much money. Here's a bunch of research on TSR. And the board of directors looked at TSR's sales numbers, looked at their debts, and was like, why are we buying this company? Like, why don't we just let it go bankrupt? Like, it's going to be way cheaper. They owe $30 million right now. If we let it go bankrupt, we're not going to have to pay $30 million in debt. And Peter Adkison argued, no, we want to take it now because we want to keep momentum. We don't want to lose staff. He had good reasons for doing it. But I will also tell you, if you go and look at, like, I've been posting Dungeons and Dragons sales numbers on Twitter and Facebook. On Twitter, I'm at @BenRiggs_. The sales numbers are absolutely appalling. Appalling. And you can see why Wizards of the Coast would have been like, why are we buying this company? This looks like a dead brand and a dying company. What are we doing here? And again, Peter Adkison did not know that he was saving Dungeons and Dragons from an unimaginable fate by arguing to purchase the company before it went bankrupt. But he did. He saved D&D. Again, I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't know it at the beginning of writing this. Peter Adkison didn't know it when it was happening.
Right.
And I do want to give credit where credit is due here. Historian Michael Kalia is the one who sent me the documents from the U.S. Copyright Office about this. And he's an absolutely brilliant researcher, and I can't thank him enough for that because I feel like that's the ultimate secret, was how close we all truly were to losing Dungeons and Dragons forever in 1996, 1997, and no one knew it except the upper echelons of TSR.
Yeah, like it's hammered home throughout the book. None of the creative staff had any idea about like how bad things were getting. It was completely kept from them.
Yeah, and I again, as I'm posting AD&D sales numbers, I fairly regularly will have TSR creatives kind of pop on and be kind of defensive about it. And again, I realize their attachment to this, but my constant refrain is, do you have some sales numbers that I don't have? Because they didn't tell you the sales numbers, did they guys? And I always try to do it gently and respectfully because it's almost always people in their 60s, and they know that D&D will be their legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been going to conventions and kind of dining out on TSR stories for decades. So I think of Ravenloft. It was designed by Bruce Nesmith and Andrea Hayday, the setting, not the adventure. And it was an amazing setting. It was great. It got a ton of supplements. Bruce Nesmith is, again, clearly a gaming genius. He went on to be the lead designer of something called Skyrim. And it sold 50,000 copies, which is not great by TSR standards. Like, it's just not a big hit. And I could understand seeing that number and feeling a bit chagrined, but never has creativity and sales do not always go together. Moby Dick failed, right? Um, so I hope that they can kind of move past seeing those numbers and just accept the greatness that they achieved for what it was. But now I know I've rambled off into the fields on that one.
Well, I even say the sales numbers don't always necessarily tell the whole story, because if you see how people react online to stuff, people were jazzed when 5th edition did the Ravenloft book that they released, Von Richten's Guide. I've been a big fan of it. Like these things have like these outsized legacies to what their sales numbers were. Like people have been begging for Spelljammer, but based on like what I've heard prior to the book, but even what you kind of reinforced, that did not sell well. Like.
No, I mean, it's funny. I have it right here. Let me pull it up, and I can tell you.
Right.
Over the course of its entire life, Spelljammer sold 83,000 copies, and you would compare that to before 1999, Forgotten Realms, for example, sold 443,000 copies.
Yeah, it's a big
yeah. So you can see why Forgotten Realms is the default setting. But Spelljammer is just so iconic and evocative, and you've got knights on ships, and it's just so cool. And all of I shouldn't say all of it, but many of the designers of D&D 5th edition are people of about our age who remember Spelljammer very fondly, and they want to see Spelljammer too, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. I got a friend that bought that nice Beetle and Grimm box set. When it comes in,
you're gonna love that.
Oh yeah. We didn't really touch on it in the beginning, but it was, I guess, before we get to the end. I guess like kind of what was your involvement with D&D prior to this book, and what really led you to wanting to write it, especially for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, where it kind of touches on some of that.
Yeah, so I've been into role-playing games since the 90s. AD&D 2nd edition was my first game, but I got into it in 7th and 8th grade when I also had no friends. Not because of AD&D 2nd edition, but it just is a coincidence. So I would buy these books and buy these novels, and I would make characters. Typically it was a elven blade singer that could wield 2 swords at once. That was my character of choice. And I'd be like, oh yeah, this character is so awesome. This is great. And my player's handbook just slowly filled up with the same elven blade singer made 7 different ways. And I played some D&D in my life. A lot of the most of 3rd edition, probably. That was probably my favorite version. Other role-playing games, though, I am hardened and inveterate and habitual about. But a lot of Call of Cthulhu, a lot of Legend of the Five Rings, a lot of Vampire. Let's see, looking around the room here, what else? Star Wars D6, Delta Green. But being from Wisconsin and having AD&D 2nd edition as my first role-playing game, even though I didn't play very much of it at all, I've really been interested in AD&D as a cultural artifact.
Right.
And I used to write for Geek and Sundry. And one day I was assigned the task of writing an article explaining to people that Wizards of the Coast didn't always make Dungeons and Dragons. And I got it because I'm in Wisconsin. A bunch of people who worked at TSR are still here. So I go and I start talking to those people. They point me to business people involved with the game. And those business people start to tell me things I've never heard before that shock me. One article becomes 3 articles. And because Geek and Sundry has, an editorial tone, they're like, Geek and Sundry should be perky, peppy, happy, like Felicia Day. Talking about how a company failed through its Random House contract did not really fit with that editorial tone. So I was like, okay, I'll just write a 10,000 word story and put it on Kickstarter and make some money that way. And then that led me to, well, if I'm going to tell this story, I should probably tell the story of TSR West, which is how, they tried to break into comic books in the 90s, and then that stretched on for thousands of words. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, and they almost made a Middle-earth setting, and that stretched on for thousands of words. And it just kept going and going and going, and it really demanded to be written. Like, I'm going to say it was 2 or 3 years in before I really realized the scope of what I was doing. And any success of the book is I think attributable to the luckiest timing of my life. When I started this 5-6 years ago, I was like, for 10,000 people, this will be the greatest book they ever read. But I don't know if it's going to have an audience beyond that. And again, now with last year Wizards saying that like 50 million people have experienced Dungeons and Dragons, whatever experienced means in that context. Right. I'm like, there's just a bigger audience there, and the time seems to be right for a popular history of Dungeons and Dragons. So here I am. I hope that everyone is right. And if you have not purchased my book yet, please do so.
So you mentioned it in your last bit of rambling. It reminded me 2 of the most surprising things in the book. One, the contract with Random House. That was surprising and baffling, especially for what it led to. And the involvement of Legend in the Five Rings in the sale of TSR to WotC was, I had never heard that.
So I'm going to take the second one first. So in the 90s, there was another collectible card game called Legend of the Five Rings. It was kind of set in medieval fantasy Asia. It was doing okay. And the owners, the guys running Legend of the Five Rings, were like, we want to get so big that we can threaten Wizards of the Coast or make them buy us at least. And they try that, and it doesn't go super well. But it just so happens that, gosh, I think he was the CEO. The CEO of Five Rings Publishing was a guy named Bob Abramowitz, who used to work in sales at TSR. He told me about how Sam Walton once personally called him up to tell him why he was dropping TSR's products due to the satanic panic from Walmarts across America. So, really interesting guy, great raconteur. And because Bob Abramowitz used to work at TSR, he was able to get an audience with Lorraine Williams. And this was when TSR was at its sickest. This was after they'd fired people before Christmas. They were being sued by Random House. Their printer was refusing to print any more product because they were owed so much money. And Bob Abramowitz manages to get a meeting with Lorraine to be like, hey, Lorraine, what if we bought TSR? And she allows him and a team to come and do due diligence at Lake Geneva. And they discover, of course, a very sick company there. And oh man, I want to say the initial numbers they talked about was buying TSR for like $40 million. Five Rings Publishing did not have $40 million. And the Five Rings Publishing team, when I talked to them, argued about whether or not it would even be possible for them to have raised that amount of money. But CEO Bob Abramowitz's plan for raising the money was just to go to Wizards of the Coast and say, hey, do you want to buy TSR? I've arranged the deal. You guys can buy TSR through us, but you have to buy us as well. And the reason that it had to go that way was because from what everyone told me at the time, CEO Lorraine Williams loathed Peter Adkison. She thought that she thought to some degree he was responsible for the problems of TSR. And she didn't like what apparently Wizards had done to the role-playing game market. And Adkison had actually gone to her and asked if he could buy TSR. And she was like, no, you can't buy TSR. Even though they were obviously struggling at that point. She was like, I'm not selling to Peter Adkison. So it was Bob Abramowitz and Five Rings Publishing that became the conduit through which Wizards was able to buy TSR. And I want to mention Lorraine eventually, got closer to Peter and came to be fine with him. Before the sale was complete, as I recall, she held a banquet for him at her house. It's like, okay, well, it must have ended well there. And looking at the time, I kind of hesitate to go on the Random House rant unless there's no questions.
We got a few, but not enough. I think we can probably do Random House and then
All right.
other questions.
So in 1979, as I recall, Gary Gygax signed a contract with Random House that Random House would be TSR's distributor into the book trade in North America. And it had a very curious clause. Most publishers, when they publish something, they send it to a distributor. When that distributor sells it to a Barnes & Noble or a Walden Books or a B. Dalton or what have you, or your local indie bookstore, that is when the publisher then gets paid. The arrangement TSR had with Random House, however, said that TSR would receive payment from Random House when product shipped to Random House, or it was received by Random House, not when it was sold. So for TSR, the shipping of product became the printing of money. Now, initially, this was put into the contract to solve a problem caused by TSR's success. Dungeons and Dragons in the early 1980s was incredibly hot. Again, it was probably the most popular time in the hobby's history, except for right now. Right now is probably the first time that we've trounced the early 1980s for popularity. So let's say the player's handbook sells out and TSR has an adventure called Ravenloft that they're supposed to publish. Well, they have to choose what they're going to republish. Are they going to republish the player's handbook and delay Ravenloft, or are they going to publish Ravenloft and, not have their core product out there for people to buy? The contract with Random House allowed them to do both. By paying TSR when Random House received product instead of when it's sold, it allowed TSR to finance their business. As long as TSR was using that power responsibly, it wasn't a big deal. Like I had a vice president at TSR tell me, as long as we didn't get more than 20% returns, it was fine. But in the 90s, what is going to happen is you're going to have this precipitous drop in D&D sales. And TSR is going to start shipping product to Random House and using that simply to run their business. As far as I can tell, there are years where TSR would ship product to Random House, generate a payment. That payment is a loan, and TSR would just put that number on their gross sales for the year. They would just add loans to their sales numbers and be like, "We did good, yay!" and just not think about the bubble of debt at Random House that's growing larger and larger and larger and larger, and you could certainly argue swamped the company at the end.
All right, so we got a few questions. I think you might have answered this, but just in case, what is your favorite D&D edition?
Ooh, that's tough. I am going to go with second edition because it was my first edition, and I'm just kind of still a sucker for it.
Yeah, I have to agree. I started playing second, and it kind of defined my childhood up until maybe early high school, and when we all started transitioning into third. And I just have so many positive memories. I'm one of the few defenders in my circle of friends. Like, no, guys, it's good. It's got a weird reputation, but it's good. You should try it.
Yeah, I mean, it was. You could also say it was the last edition of D&D that felt like it had to encompass the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like a lot of those supplements and products, when we were reading them, or at least when I was reading them, I wasn't really learning how to build a better character. I was learning how to build a better me.
I can feel that. I played a lot of paladins and wizards.
Oh, I can see paladin. I can see it.
Yeah, they were fun. As long as you weren't like the fun police, that was when they got not fun. All right, so outside of D&D, you mentioned a few RPGs you liked, but what's your absolute favorite RPG, D&D or otherwise?
That's a tough one. Absolute favorite role-playing game. I'm going to go Legend of the Five Rings. Legend of the Five Rings. The first edition was written by John Wick, It looks like this. And like I said, it's set in medieval fantasy Asia, and you think it's going to be some sort of a like knockoff of D&D just
Right.
with katanas. But the thing that I found radical within it at the time was it has essentially a prohibition on violence. So there's a bunch of samurai clans. They're all in conflict. But you as a samurai can't just go and kill a samurai from another clan because, first of all, that samurai is the property of their lord. And if you go and destroy the property of another lord, guess what? You're starting a war between the clans. Furthermore, you don't belong to yourself either. You are the property of your lord. If you want to go and start a feud with another samurai, like you need your lord's permission. You can't just go and like use violence to solve problems. There will be political consequences, and it was a game that was politics first. And it's fair to say it is a kind of version of Japanese culture, although again it's a version of Japanese culture created by 40-something white dudes in the 90s.
Yeah.
But that said, like it valued sincerity over truth. To give one example, and so there was a skill sincerity where like people care about whether you appear to be telling the truth, not so much about whether or not you actually are. So it really it transported you. It forced you to play in creative ways. It forced you to change your thinking. And it was inspired in many ways by RuneQuest, which I didn't get into RuneQuest until like the past few years. But it was a game that just I've probably played more Legend of the Five Rings than any other game in my life.
All right. Do you have any books you'd recommend for RPG fans?
Oh, wow. I feel like I want to ask a follow-up question, but I won't. I will say instead Art and Arcana by John Peterson and Michael Whitwer. It's just the D&D history art book. Game Wizards by John Peterson. If you have not read Game Wizards, like again, my book does tell the complete story of TSR from 1974 to 1997. Game Wizards, however, focuses on 1974 to 1985 and Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the co-creators of D&D. And the writer John Peterson had access to just incredible primary source documents. And for those of you who don't know, Gygax and Arneson, despite being co-creators, very rapidly fell out. And it's fair to say Gygax drove Arneson out of the world of D&D work. And Peterson had such incredible access to documents that Gygax was on the Tonight Show one night, apparently in the early 1980s. And because of the early 1980s, Dave Arneson did not have a VCR to record watching Gary Gygax on the Tonight Show. So instead, he just got a tape recorder and he tape recorded the audio of this. And on it, somebody asks Gygax, well, tell me about characters in D&D. And he's like, well, there's, fighters, there's wizards, there's thieves. And Dave Arneson, as he's watching this on national television, says alone in Minnesota at night in his apartment or whatever, you're the thief, and Peterson gets that. Somehow he gets the tape, he's like, oh, I'm going to listen to this weird tape Dave Arneson made in 1980. And that's what he hears. He hears Dave Arneson sitting alone in his living room, cursing at co-creator Gary Gygax from beyond the grave, beyond the decades. And just that level of visceral detail is so fantastic. So I highly recommend Game Wizards. Is there anything else that I would throw out there that I'd recommend for role-playing game fans? Moby Dick.
Just trying to make that one be successful. Is that what the goal?
Moby Dick is just my favorite book, so I kind of come back to it a lot. If you're looking for a weird game that's amazing, Thousand Year Vampire is a fantastic solo writing role playing game, and it's pretty cheap on online. Let's see, the One Ring role playing game from Free League in Sweden is fantastic. And Annie Proulx's The Shipping News.
I haven't heard of that one.
It's just a good book. I'm just shouting things out now. Okay, I'll do one more. Dangerous Games by Joseph P. Laycock. It is the finest history of the Satanic Panic and the way it affected role-playing games of any book I've seen. He's an academic at the University of Texas. It's so good. He went and he found the titles of newspaper articles from the late 70s, early 80s describing role-playing games. Let's see, can I flip right to that page in a convenient fashion? I cannot, unfortunately. But he also has some very interesting ideas about how the Satanic Panic was fueled by the concerns of the religious. And he does point out that while at the time role-playing game defenders were like, it's just a game, it's not a religion. And yet Laycock points out that while role-playing games are not religions, they do have religious aspects to them. For example, ritual, the idea of embracing the numinous. A good role-playing game adds a salt to life is a thing I say all the time. If you're in a good role-playing game, even if you play it once a week, it makes the rest of your life better because it somehow opens your mind to new possibilities and has you thinking about things. And that religion does something similar, according to Laycock. So if you want to read both a good history and someone who's just thinking deeply about role-playing games, Joseph P. Laycock's Dangerous Games is what I would recommend to you. As a matter of fact, I'll stand on that one. I worked my way up to a good answer, and that's my good answer.
I'll have to look that one up. So I think we got some more time. I don't have any other questions, or there's no other questions in the chat. There was one story that was painful for me to read. I have to imagine it was painful for you to hear and write about. The storage unit that they had to 11th hour empty out.
So if any of you ever made the trek out to Milwaukee for Gen Con in the 90s, you would know that the center of the Gen Con convention hall was a foam TSR castle. And you could go in the castle, and in the nooks and crannies, there would be miniatures and dioramas, and you could play test TSR products and buy them right there and take them home. And it was fantastic. And the miniatures and dioramas typically were painted by TSR artists. So again, genius level fantasy artists painting miniatures for company use in demos at TSR. And apparently, these, when Gen Con wasn't happening, resided in a storage unit about an hour south of Milwaukee in a suburb called Kenosha or Racine. I forget which one. And in 1997, when TSR is at its lowest and had no money coming in, a day came when the storage unit said that they were going to take everything in that storage unit and throw it out. So third edition designer Monty Cook had to get into his boss's pickup truck, drive to the storage unit, and when they got there, they had 1 hour to throw what they thought was the most important stuff into the back of his boss's truck, and that was what they were going to take away. And Monty Cook told me that it was the storage unit was the size of like a 4-car garage, packed from floor to ceiling with armies of miniatures, countless dioramas. There was some Spelljammer diorama that, like, you know, had spaceships on it. There was a piece of a dragon's lair, and the artist had painted the bones of dead adventurers in this dragon's lair. And Monty Cook told me that they could only get a fraction of
Right.
what was in that Titanic storage unit. And the rest ended up in a landfill in southern Wisconsin, and that's it. And it's just shocking and depressing to hear what happened to all those amazing artifacts. And in some ways, it's a warning of how close not TSR, but how close Dungeons and Dragons itself came to destruction in the mid-late 90s.
I love collecting minis, and like would love to get like Dwarven Forge stuff. So just reading about that, especially there was like a mountaintop that you could take off, and there was like a functional dungeon in there. Like, oh, that made me actively sad when I was reading that part of the book.
I'm pleased to hear that you had that reaction.
So, well, I don't have any other questions. Nick, do you have anything? I know you're still listening to us.
No, that was a lot of information to process for me. Like I said, I've just gotten to the game like in the last 4 years. So, wow. I don't know, Ben, how... I understand you did the research. You found this all out. You probably knew quite a bit. But how you retain this? How you retaining this without references?
You know, you write 100,000 words. You read it a bunch of times. You know.
Oh my God! But you have receipts in your head. You have the receipts. Like, I can quote this person. They said this. Oh my gosh.
I do think that so I give seminars on TSR history at conventions. I think that really helps. The fact that, you know, not only do I have to read it a bunch for the book, but then I have to say it aloud and again and say it aloud and say it aloud and say it aloud. I think that's why it gets drilled in there.
It's kind of surprising that if you're speaking at all these conventions about it, that like, especially this year at Comic-Con, because they're doing a big push for the D&D movie. Like, it would have been a perfect moment to have you there to talk about the history of it, or even just to promote this book. Like, there's so much good synergy for you at Comic-Con this year.
The problem, though, would be, and I will tell you this right now, unofficially, I have extreme interest in my work from people at Wizards of the Coast. Officially, no one wants to acknowledge my existence. Because, you know, again, I'm doing things like just dumping sales numbers on Twitter. I tell a story of Wizards of the Coast co-founder, and also, again, to the degree that Wizards is TSR, I tell the story of its failure at one point. You know, I am in no way engaging in hagiography. Like that's been the number one question I get is, oh, is this just some like feel good piece that's going to make everyone look like an amazing hero? And I'm like, no. The co-creator of D&D slept with prostitutes and did drugs. Like, you know, and I talk about that.
Stating the facts.
Yeah. Like, I have witnesses who were there who talk about it. And you know, like, for Wizards of the Coast to publicly acknowledge me and, like, you know, drag me to a seminar where I might say something that like Hasbro doesn't like, which then would be the question, then provokes the question of, well, if Hasbro doesn't like what I said, who brought that guy to our event? Let's fire that person. And I think that is why officially I've gotten nothing. I've gotten officially nothing from Wizards of the Coast that has to do with the book. And I hope this doesn't sound like a criticism, because, like, you know, once everyone currently interested in this leaves Wizards of the Coast, I'm sure they're all going to come talk to me. They're going to tell me everything that's going on right now. And then in 10 years from now, we're going to have an amazing book about 5th edition. But yeah, while they're there, I am a dangerous person, and, you know, inviting me. Now, the only thing that I think I could totally see myself getting called out to Seattle to, like, internally meet with them. And, you know, like a thing I've heard from Wizards of the Coast people is they don't have TSR sales numbers, which I think is insane. I'm like, there has to be a basement somewhere in Seattle where they have this stuff. Maybe they don't know it's there, but there has to be a basement in Seattle where they have this stuff. What did they do?
Just like on a database, I guess. But
yeah. So again, I could see myself like getting flown out there to consult, but I think that having me speak in public would be dangerous for whoever has me do it.
That is fair. But this is a chance for everyone who's watching now or in the future. If you want to read the history of TSR, hands off, not hand off, but Wizards of the Coast, get it. Lies, betrayal, money, mismanagement, hookers, satanic panic. It sounds like this will be your book, and you're not going to get that lovey feel good story. You're going to get the whole story.
Yeah, reviewers have described it as a dishy tell-all page turner.
Oof. All right. I hope you're all ready for that, and I hope you do buy it. Don't forget, not only can you get the copy of the book, pre-order right now, but after tomorrow, you can buy it. And the wonderful signed book plates, which are very special too. Wonderful designs on them. Remind me again.
The only way to get art from D&D icon Jeff Easley.
Thank you.
You'll get your own, you know. So go get it. It's beautiful. There's no way to share my screen, is there?
Oh, you mean? Oh, no, not safe. Like, yeah, not in a no, unfortunately.
There's no way to post a picture. There's no way to post a picture in chat.
No, unfortunately,
okay,
there's no like loading of pictures or stuff.
Okay, then you'll just have to have faith that it's beautiful.
It is, yes. Thank you so much, Ben, for doing this and being here. Congratulations on the eve of your release. Tom, thank you so much for being in conversation tonight. I appreciate you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'll be back for anything you ever want me to do.
All right. Be careful what you wish for.
Will do.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you all have a good day, evening, whatever time or day it is. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Keep